Yes, I think people were very nonchalant about what was happening in the US when I first visited. And the authoritarian country was Turkey, not the US. And the strongman was Erdoğan and not Trump.
This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval or authoritarian takeover, with an eye on Trump and Musk's America. I'm Jeremy Goldkorn. My Jewish Latvian grandparents immigrated to South Africa before World War II, and I grew up in the apartheid era, just down the road from Elon Musk. I lived in China for 20 years, and I've been living in Nashville, Tennessee in the American South since 2015. Today I'm hosting alone. Maria Repnikova can't make it again today, but she'll be on the next podcast. Please subscribe at rhymingchaos.com to get notifications, or even better, support us and take out a paid subscription. Today I am delighted to welcome Kaya Genç to the show. Kaya is the author of 4 books, The Lion and the Nightingale, which I've just read. It's almost like a novel, but it's an account of happenings in Istanbul and around the country, and stories of the lives of all kinds of Turkish people from different social strata in the year 2017, which was just after the 2016 coup attempt. Kaya has also written Under the Shadow, Rage and Revolution in Modern Turkey, published in 2016. And an Istanbul Anthology, published in 2015. And those are all available in English. In Turkish, there's a novel called Macera, or Macera, that has yet to be translated into English, as far as I know. Kaya is also a prolific journalist who writes about all kinds of subjects, from LGBTQ life in Turkey to politics, to youth culture, to the environment. He often returns in his writing to the city he still lives in, Istanbul, and despite all of the problems in Turkey, his writing makes me long for a stay in that magical city. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Kaya.
Hello, Jeremy. Very good to be here. And thanks for this lovely introduction.
Thank you. Firstly, you're in California right now. What brings you to our crazy country?
Yes, I'm in Santa Cruz. I'm here on a mission to talk about my book about the Turkish government's assault on artistic communities in Turkey. And I was at Northwestern University last week. I was in Chicago, and I see an increased interest in the problems of Turkey at the moment, which is very similar to what I've experienced in 2017 when I came just after Trump was first elected. So it's an interesting time to be in the US, and I'm living in this campus at the moment, in Santa Cruz, college town, but everyone very concerned about Trump and his politics and the future here for progressive people and scholars. So it's an interesting time to be here.
So, this show's shtick is to look at other countries to seek rhymes and parallels with Trump and Musk's America of 2025. As you mentioned, in your 2017 visit to New York, people were also drawing some parallels with Trump's first term and Turkey. You wrote in The Lion and the Nightingale, one cold morning I visited New York Public Radio. I was interviewed on the Leonard Lopate show in Istanbul. I'd listened to that program every day. I was curious to see whether he would steer the conversation more towards Turkey's past or toward America's present. He did the former. Yet, even if nobody drew that parallel, I sensed people silently considered Turkey as a laboratory that could teach them about the future of the United States more than the history of my country. I found this frustrating. Treating foreign cultures as testing grounds for their own was quintessential Orientalism. So, Kaya, do you still feel that way? Because I have to say, reading The Lion and the Nightingale and dipping into your earlier book, Under the Shadow, gives me the feeling of reading postcards from America's future.
Yes, I think people were very nonchalant about what was happening in the US when I first visited. And the authoritarian country was Turkey, not the US. And the strongman was Erdoğan and not Trump. And Turkey was kind of situated in this specific region of countries that have been undemocratic or illiberal for long decades. And I think despite the concerns about what Trump would do in the US in his first term, there was still a kind of relaxed attitude that it couldn't happen to us in a broader sense. It wouldn't happen here. I think the perspective on Turkey was frustrating because Turkey was classified as a specimen, a special case from which people could learn stuff or people could study. But when in reality, the people in Istanbul were experiencing very similar frustrations with people in New York, and this sense of togetherness in an age of oppression, I think that was overlooked at the time. People, I think, ignored how internationalist right-wing populism is, because right-wing populism learns from each other. As leftists, we always think that, George Orwell goes to Spain to fight the international brigades. The left learns from each other, learns from different examples, and evolves according to this international solidarity. But this is exactly what Steve Bannon and right-wing populists around the world have been doing. They've been studying each other's cases, and Turkey had been very interesting. So if you look at Bannon, he's the Orientalist par excellence because he studied, I think, Turkey very closely, because in Turkey, the kind of constructed opposition between the elites and the popular will has been very good for the party who said they're supporting the popular will, the ruling AKP party, the Justice and Development Party. They really mastered the art of elite bashing, and I think right-wing Americans really studied that history well, while the progressives, I think they failed to see the kind of similarities between two cultures and kind of holding Turkey with gloved hands and like treating it as something more exotic and interesting and curious, whereas in just a few years, America looks like Turkey a lot.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that. Perhaps we could start with a bit of a review of Turkish history. And if I may be ridiculously presumptuous and sum up Turkey's long and complex history in a few lines, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which was a vast Islamic empire that ruled parts of Southeastern Europe, West Asia, and North Africa from the 14th to the early 20th century, Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, founded the Republic of Turkey in 1923 as a secular nationalist and modernized state. Ever since then, Turkey has been almost a part of the Western world, but not quite, perhaps befitting its geographical location. It joined NATO, but not the European Union, for example. Nonetheless, Turkey remained a secular democratic state for most of the 20th century. And then in 2002, Erdoğan became prime minister, leading his Justice and Development Party that you just mentioned, or AKP, to a landslide victory in the election for the Grand National Assembly. And he became prime minister the following year after winning a by-election. Is that not too inaccurate? And if that little summary works for you, let me ask a question. What was Erdoğan's attraction for Turks in 2002, 2003?
Yeah, I think that's a very smooth and nice summary. But I think we have to remember the conflicts in late Ottoman Empire in late 19th century. The two movements, one young Ottomans and the other young Turks. Young Turks are more famous and they've entered the English language in an interesting way as well. But the young Ottoman movement, we have to understand, lies at the heart of Erdoğan's project. And what did young Ottomans say? Late 19th century was a period of intense modernization and Europeanization and Westernization for the Ottomans. And this was done by very powerful bureaucrats, a kind of bureaucratic elite modernizing the Ottoman state. And they actually wielded more power than the Sultan, those bureaucrats, those pashas. And they kind of introduced a dose of imitative spirit to the Ottoman elite. Like, let's just imitate what the French aristocrats are doing, what the Italians and the British are doing. And so there was kind of unrest among the populace about these bureaucrats, about these modernizing bureaucrats. And the young Ottomans said, we cannot just change our constitution and our centuries-long state rules and regulations according to the West. We have to make a kind of combination. We can't just pick one there and pick something from the Quran and pick something from France. They were not like completely anti-Western or anti-European, but they were just moderate about the inclusion of European culture in Turkey. And so they had lots of support from the people, especially from Islamic lodges, who opposed the wholesale Europeanization of Ottoman culture. So that movement, the young Ottomans, were periodically suppressed by the government because the pashas, the modernizing pashas, they weren't very happy with those young Ottomans and they ended up imprisoning them. And during the 20s, as you say, we switched from the caliphate and the sultanate to the republic. Those ideas were still popular because a large mass of people opposed the way in which the Turkish state was formed as a republic, on European lines. And the kind of young Ottomans of the modern Republican era, they couldn't speak in public because their ideas were seen as regressive and anti-Republican. And for long decades, those politicians weren't allowed to speak in public. And with Erdoğan, we see those ideas coming to the fore at the hands of a very skilled orator. And as mayor of Istanbul in the 1990s, he has this huge platform and this huge city where the secularized people sit alongside Islamic lodges, and some people are drinking rakı, others are doing Islamic rituals, and very street smart and savvy Erdoğan just kind of installs these ideas, these young Ottoman ideas, into his discourse, and he becomes a very attractive proposition, even for those who are not strictly religious, because he offered this kind of alternate reading of Turkish modernization, because you have to understand that Turkish modernization was very harsh, and the leftists, the environmentalists, all kinds of people were critical about it, but those criticisms were not allowed on the public sphere, and somehow Erdoğan just brought together these concerned voices together and built his movement.
Can you explain a little bit about Islamic lodges, what that means exactly?
And so the Ottoman Empire was very much based on the culture and traditions of Islamic lodges, like different Islamic lodges wielding different types of power. The Sufis, the most famous one, based in Istanbul, they're followers of this great poet, Rumi, and after his death, they want to read his poetry, sing songs, and dance in memory of him and his ideas. And these lodges have unorthodox view of Islam. They don't follow the strict Sunni Islamic rituals. They experience Islam as a way of living. It's a kind of wholesale life. You live in the lodge, you live in a cell, you learn how to dance, you learn how to play the flute, you learn how to sing and dance. It's like almost a commune, and it offers a way of living to the unemployed, to the poor, and it feeds the poor, it educates people, and those who are educated in these lodges, maybe they become bureaucrats in the Ottoman Empire, or they become policemen or journalists, and they never lose their ties to the lodge. And so the lodge itself has this immense power in society, and they try to place their own people, their own graduates, to higher office in Ottoman bureaucracy. But of course, for the Republic, this was a problem because it meant there was a power other than the centralized government that had some influence on how public servants ran their business. So they closed all the lodges. With the foundation of the Republic, all the lodges go underground and they cannot perform their dances, their music. Many flee abroad, they're exiled. But behind closed doors, underground, they continue their operations. So in Istanbul, if you go to a neighborhood like Çarşamba, for example, you see very colorful group of people dressed up in, let's say, 14th century clothes and going around that way. And they really want to continue this tradition because it's something they learned from their parents and they want to give it to their own children. So these people, they don't always dress as fancy as that. Sometimes they're in business attire in the government bureaucracy. And it's very important for a Turkish politician to be in good terms with the leaders of these lodges because they have so much power. And I'm sure we'll come to that in our conversation. But the coup attempt in 2016 was all about this conflict between one particular Islamic sect and the Turkish government.
Yeah, let's get to that a little bit later. To talk about the early years of Erdoğan's rule, from the outside, there didn't seem to be a lot of worry about the direction of Turkey. In fact, there was economic growth. There were reforms that appeared to be democratic, talks about joining the EU. And in fact, in 2008, The Economist, which is a pretty good indicator of sort of very mainstream Western thinking, said autocratic regimes in the Muslim world often ban religious parties, which then go underground and turn violent. Turkey's Islamists have taken a different path. Despite being repeatedly outlawed and ejected from power, pious politicians have shunned violence, embraced democracy, and moved into the mainstream. No Islamic party has been as moderate and pro-Western as the AKP, which catapulted into government in 2002, promising to lead Turkey into the European Union. It sounds so different, from now. So, what happened after that? What was behind Erdogan's autocratic turn? And when did you start sensing that it was going to happen?
Yeah, so when I was in college in early 2000s, the status quo was the Turkish secularists and the Kemalists, the staunch defenders of the founder of modern Turkey, Kemal Atatürk, and his ideas. And if you criticized any of the founding principles of the Turkish state, you got into trouble. And so Erdogan was using that opposition to that status quo to his advantage and promising freedoms by joining the European Union and liberalizing the Turkish society. And it was a very attractive proposition. You have to remember that those were post 9/11 years when Islamophobia was a big concern among intellectuals, the rise of Islamophobia. And we saw in the US, in George W. Bush, the US, very similar things with Turkey, because when Turkey was under the reign of the Kemalists, the openly Islamic people were treated very much similarly to those in the post 9/11 US. And so it was very welcome, this liberalization of political culture and its relations with the Muslims, let's say. But I remember in early 2010s, people were saying, let's give the same freedoms to LGBTQ people that we are now giving to the pious and the Islamists. If headscarved people, they deserve the freedom that we didn't give them for many decades. Now you can be in state bureaucracy with your headscarf and so on. But let's do the same for LGBTQ people. Let them openly express themselves, and maybe let's put those ideas into the constitution. And the Islamists were very quickly angered by this proposition, like finding it against Islam, against the Quran. And in all the kind of liberal outlets that I was following at the time, I remember lots of debates about this, and it simply cannot be allowed, they were saying. The former liberals, so-called liberals of the Islamist party, the so-called liberal opinion leaders of the governing party were very concerned about the implications of liberalizing LGBTQ culture in Turkey. But I think the queer thing is very indicative of the culture. When you see queer bashing in late Victorian era, the imprisonment of Oscar Wilde and all that, you see this is the footsteps of something very nasty and ugly and fascistic coming. And I think it was also a very early indicator, these debates about LGBTQ culture. And then also environmental concerns. The government was okay with giving freedoms to certain groups, but if you were a hardline environmentalist who didn't like the government's project, you could end up in detainment. And in 2013, concerned environmentalists joined LGBTQI people and other disgruntled groups, and they just occupied a public park called Gezi in Istanbul. And that was the moment when all the civil society that felt very liberated not liberated, but kind of freer under Erdogan's reign, suddenly started demanding more. Let's really bring these issues to the table. Why can't we have a legitimate LGBTQI culture in Turkey? Why can't we openly discuss militarism and its implications and the need for environmental protections? And then when those people really took the stage, and they did so in a very unified manner, very powerful manner, and very picturesque manner, creating these incredible scenes, all these young people in their thousands, and lots of graduate students, like all the best educated people. And then Erdogan felt this was a huge betrayal of his own project. And I think he felt that he was the one giving those sectors of society a kind of freedom with which they could go to this public park and occupy it. And then the governing party pictured this as a stab in the back. And then all kind of anti-Semitic discourse came from that first reaction to the protests.
The Jews were organizing this. Was that the story?
Yes, they were openly saying it. Some said it was the Lufthansa and the German government because they were afraid that Istanbul was building this new airport which would be a great hub. And then the Germans were jealous of it and they wanted Lufthansa to succeed. And so Lufthansa was organizing this. And there were all these protests. Some said Wall Street Jews were organizing it by using telekinesis, like using the telekinetic messages from Manhattan. And there were all kinds of theories. And these theories were mocked, but the people who were voicing those theories soon became president's closest aides, because these irrational ideas somehow were the Islamists were the only way to explain what was going on. So there was a crisis of legitimization and crisis of discourse. Suddenly they couldn't explain why they were opposing those people on the streets. And so they just said, okay, if this is the only explanation we can have, let's have them. And that's when the government's hard right shift began.
Wow. Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, that does rhyme a little bit in the United States with the reaction against the Black Lives Matter protests and the increased visibility of trans people. And you had some crazy anti-Semitic theories, Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about Jewish space lasers causing the wildfires. But obviously the context is really different. So then 2013, the reaction starts against what Erdogan might see as the liberal demons that he had unleashed. And so there are 3 years or so of regression. And then in 2016, there's a coup. Let's talk about the coup. And I think for the non-Turks, which is most of our listeners, can you explain a little bit about the position of the military in Turkey and how the coup came about? And you referred earlier to also a religious aspect to it. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so the father figure in Turkish society was the military for many decades, from the 1920s until early 2000s. The governing force in Turkey was the military and the armed forces and its representatives, and they would speak on behalf of Atatürk. And it's, of course, very convenient to speak on behalf of someone who died in 1938. And so all kinds of ideas could be legitimized this way. So if a military general didn't like queer people, he could say Atatürk didn't like queer people. He could just find a writing and just interpret it that way. It was almost a kind of religious attitude. It was a religion, really. The Kemalist thing was a religion. People thought it was going to be replaced by something more rational and liberal, but of course, it was replaced by another religion. But the military was very influential in deciding the outcomes of elections because, they could just trash talk a politician or a party, or can just throw a leader into the arena of courts and just destroy their careers. So people didn't like that, this kind of divine intervention of the Turkish military. And Erdogan presented himself as the person who would teach them a lesson, who would teach them to behave, and even during his first decade in power, the military was still grumbling and organizing these documents against Erdogan and his policies and giving interviews to columnists. And there was always this fear that there was going to be an uprising, a military uprising. There would be a coup, and this would be initiated by the military's dislike for the European Union's demands on democratizing the military and the role of the military. And so that was the fear. I mean, that had this root, which I think was real, but then the government really started using it as its main tool. So all it talked about was democratizing the military and the kind of fighting against the militarist mindset. But what was the militarist mindset? So if you were a leftist who liked to talk about progressive ideas, suddenly you found yourself being called a militarist and a Jacobin and militarist. Those words were thrown around every day. And so this became very useful, as I was saying about Steve Bannon and elite bashing. This thing has a source. Yes, the Turkish military intervened in elections. They were undemocratically influential on the political scene. Yes, this happened. But then you take that, and while Erdogan and his party increase their control over the state, they still say that, the military is so powerful, we are fighting against it. And you suddenly realize that all those people are either imprisoned or they are deposed or they are exiled. But the conversation continues and it firms into this hard rhetoric. And when the governing AKP was doing it, it had a problem in terms of personnel. In its first years, the secularists didn't want to work for AKP, didn't want to work as its bureaucrats. So there was a staffing problem. And so Erdogan worked with the followers of this very influential preacher, Fethullah Gülen, who had been living in Pennsylvania for years in exile because before Erdoğan came to power, Gülen felt that he would be imprisoned in Turkey. So he went into exile and he came to the US and he started directing his base from Pennsylvania, and he was called the man behind the Atlantic. He had all these monikers in Turkey. Lots of people grew up in the schools that were founded by Gülen, universities that were founded by him, and he had newspapers, radio stations. He had this huge empire of cultural and political institutions. And as I was saying about the Islamic lodges, the movement had this aim to raise civil servants for the Turkish state. That was its aim. And also to just propagate Turkish ideas around the world. So if there was an event about Turkey in New York, it would be organized by followers of Gülen because they were the ones who were well educated, who could speak good English, who had the connections. And so maybe they would speak about the rise of democracy in Turkey and how the AKP was really fighting against the militarist past of Turkey. So they were really giving Turkey a great name, and also brand management all around the world. The brand of Turkey, Erdoğan's Turkey, was managed by the Gülenist movement. But apparently this gave them too much power and influence, which made Erdoğan and his inner circle uncomfortable. And at one point in 2014, they tried to close the schools of this movement, preparatory schools for universities. We call them dershane. You go there in high school to prepare for the university exam. And once those preparatory schools are closed, the war begins between the followers of this preacher and the Turkish government. And of course, the problem for the government is they don't know who is particularly connected to this movement. When the uprising begins in 2016, they cannot guess the extent of it. So do they have F-16 pilots? Do they have tanks? Do they have following among commanders in this part of military? So it's all very opaque. And one night in July 2016, we watch it play out, like this fight between these two Islamist groups. And it's a very violent night, and it sort of reveals who is on whose side. I mean, for people like me who are leftists or who are communists, Marxists, I mean, for us, we just watch it like a film. But for many people, like bus drivers and police officers, it's about their team or the other team. Because at that time, to be able to be employed in Turkey, you had to belong to one of these two teams. So it was, I think, very decisive in many people's lives and ordinary people's lives too. So it was a very catalytic moment.
So after that, after the coup attempt, Erdoğan stays in power. There are purges in academia, journalism, in the government, in the civil service. And some of your friends leave Turkey and you sort of face a decision and you decide to stay. I mean, it's not a diary, but it's a record of a year that you wrote, The Lion and the Nightingale, which is really 2017. You spend time with all kinds of people in Turkey trying to understand what the country is going through, I think. Can you talk about your decision to stay and to write the book, and perhaps also explain what the lion and the nightingale symbolize?
Yes, I've been very active and traveling a lot around the same time. I just published my first book, Under the Shadow, and I remember correcting the proofs on the night of the coup. So after the coup happened, my publisher said, let's also include an afterword for this. When I talked about that book, everyone asked me about the coup and the fight between these groups in Turkey. And I found myself explaining Turkey to very different audiences and traveling a lot. But also I felt a kind of imposter syndrome because I was free and I was traveling all around the world and I didn't get into trouble. And I was kind of concerned, like, why am I not in trouble? Why is no one going after me? And so all the editors that I worked with in Istanbul, all the novelists whom I lionized in my youth, I was reading about their court statements, and they were kind of turning into these figures like Alfred Dreyfus, these kind of victimized figures very openly. So you can see their innocence very clearly, but if they go after Dreyfus because, he's Jewish, and because if the culture is anti-Semitic, it just happens and you just watch it and then you try to rush to their defense like Emil Zola. And so in Turkey, the problem is I was seeing those people who were openly victimized in 2017. But if you rush to their defense, then you became a victim and then someone else had to rush to your defense. So it was a very difficult time to see friends getting into trouble. So I think before 2017, I was writing in a more kind of objective and cool way, like trying to give voice to both sides and just to be a fly on the wall and not trying to get too much involved in what was going on. But then this attitude of writing, this attitude of covering Turkey made me feel very guilty, and I wanted to also come to terms with my own responsibility and my own role as a writer. And then I think started growing this more op-ed voice, like more opinionated voice, editorializing about what was going on in Turkey, because it was so openly horrific that you just couldn't include any government points in your coverage of Turkey. I was lucky enough to be writing for foreign publications, so I could develop that voice. In Turkey, the newspaper that I worked for, Radical, was bankrupted by the government, and there was basically no way to make money as a writer in Turkey. And so I was covering all these characters, and my editor in London, his girlfriend was doing the Venice Biennale for UK, and so my editor spent time in Venice, and he was looking at all these lion sculptures in Venice. They all represent the kind of the might of the Republic of Venice. And he was editing my book at the time, which didn't have a title yet. And then he said, you're talking about all these poetic characters who sing songs and write poems. They're the kind of nightingales. And nightingale is a very common feature in Ottoman poetry. Like the beloved is always represented as a nightingale, a beautiful sight and sound thing. And then there are the lions in the book, all these government forces, let's call it the lion and the nightingale. So my editor came up with the title. And I like that it's like a kind of neat distinction between the forces of power and the forces of culture and art. And I think for me, the book was like my farewell to objectivism. Not objectivism, but just to being like, okay, let's hear what the government has to say and let's find ways to talk more to the government, because it was such an uneven playing field. I think if you covered Turkey in those years, you could feel a bit used by the government, because the government was very good at controlling its coverage, not only in Turkish, but in English as well. So I became very critical and very conscious about the whole issue of covering Turkey. That year was a kind of education for me.
How is it now, 2025, for artists, writers, activists, environmentalists, LGBTQ communities, and for you yourself? What's the level of oppression you feel? And I've been asking this question of quite a lot of people, from different countries recently, trying to get a gauge on it. One of the odd things about being in the US right now is I grew up in apartheid South Africa, and then I lived in China. And both of those countries, I've always had the sense that something could go very wrong very quickly. I've never entered the airport in China really without a slight feeling of nervousness that something could go wrong. And even leaving the airport, I've always felt that. And now I suddenly find myself having those feelings in the United States. But how is Turkey? I mean, do you worry about your safety or being taken away? Do you worry about your friends? And do you know where the lines are that you can't cross if you want to stay safe or not?
Yeah, I think it was more dangerous around 2017. I think 2017 was the worst year for Turkey in recent history, after the coup with the purges and everything, because you didn't know where the line was and whether you were in trouble or not. And there was an active war going on between different sides. And the government was still interested in presenting itself as a democratic government, which is just doing the right thing. And they were giving the examples of post-1989 Germany. Like, this is the same thing that happened to the East German officials. Those officials were also purged, so why can't we purge our own unruly officials? So this has now changed, and the government has no interest in, I think, presenting itself as a kind of democratic government anymore. Maybe they even take pride in this kind of strongman regime. I think it has been firmly established that Turkey is an illiberal democracy and it's going to full-blown autocracy in recent months with the arrest of Istanbul's mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu. Government doesn't dispute that. So it's kind of settled, there's no debate anymore. 7 years ago, the government had these aspirations and these ideas that it was a kind of alternative model, just as you read in The Economist, this model for the Middle East, this and that, this democratic movement. All that has gone. It's just a sheer will to survive. But I feel safe in Turkey, and I think when I enter the country, I don't feel concerned because I know now where the lines are and I know the situation now. But when I entered the US, for example, I was almost trembling, because the person in front of me was just taken away to an interrogation room after being questioned for half an hour. And now this fear that comes just after the first urges and all this nasty stuff begins, as I described in my book, 2017, that's the cloud of unknowing. It's very dangerous, anything can happen. And it's a kind of opportunity for your enemies. Like if someone doesn't like your podcasts or your journalism, they can just say, he's aligned with this group and with those terrorists and this and that. As on social media, we see on X, people just mentioning a government institution, an agency, and saying, this person is to be in prison. And then ICE officers or whatever, they just come and grab those people. So we experienced something similar in 2017, this culture of informing on your neighbor or your colleague. And I used to hear in the kind of affluent parts of Istanbul and Nişantaşı, like waiting on the street, someone saying, I'll just say that he's a Gülenist so that I get his position. It's like it was something, maybe it was a joke, but, even as a joke, people considered just informing on their colleagues just to get their position. And this is what happened with Turkish media, for example. In Turkish media, all the titles, most of the titles remained, but the people there just informed on their colleagues and they get them fired. And this all happened around the time of 2013, 14, 15, 16, all those years. This creates this ugly spectacle. Some people love watching people getting sacked from their positions from CNN, from NBC or whatever. And this huge audience was watching gladiators fight out their struggle.
Yeah.
But in Turkey, it's kind of now settled. It hasn't been settled in a good way for people like me, but it has been settled somehow.
It's settled enough that you're relatively confident that you know what the rules are.
Yeah, exactly.
You write in The Lion and the Nightingale, most Turks enjoyed the character that Kevin Spacey played in the television series House of Cards. And you were talking to a group in London, I think, and you mentioned a muted respect toward cunning, opportunistic, unforgiving political leaders defined the Turkish electorate. And that struck me as reminiscent of the way some Americans feel about Trump, that they like some of his character attributes that others may consider flaws. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I mean, this unemotional and more like cunning and calculating and scheming character. And in Turkey, the word politicians, siyasetçi, and siyasa comes from the word it's I think, Iranian word that's about controlling a horse. Can you control a horse? Because the current event is a horse, and then you have to be able to ride it. And if you're a good siyasetçi, if you're a good politician, then you have the control of the horse. Then you just move with it and just, kind of dance with it, and you devote your life to it. Ethics and ideas, it's all about riding that particular horse and not falling off. And some people find that impressive in itself. Just by not falling off the horse, you are doing something. But then to be on the horse in a country like Turkey, it means you have to lock up all your opponents. If you have to silence all these, activist groups, then what does it take away from you? And so I see that most of people with the good values, the good ethics, they say that we don't want to be politicians because we don't want to be a siyasetçi, we don't want to ride that horse. But if you find that, for example, for right-wing for right-wing politicians, I think the power itself becomes an end in itself. And I think they're having a better time riding that horse. And, Erdogan is a kind of good poker player. He doesn't reveal his hand and he's very patient, and all these things is, of course, good for people who share his politics. But if you're on the other side of political divide, then of course it's terrifying, because you know that he somehow ends up doing what he wants at the end. For example, there was this law about collecting dogs on the streets last year, and you first read it in very extreme form. They leak it to some reporter and they say, oh, they're going to collect all the stray dogs in Istanbul and euthanize them in masses. It's kind of this shocking image. And then slowly they say, oh, we're not going to euthanize them. We're going to put them in cages and kill them there using different methods. And then they say, okay, we're not going to kill them. We're just going to lock them for life. So on and on, they present this policy that they want to present. And at the end, you almost feel happy that the dogs are collected on the street, because at the end, they're not in cages, placed into this farm where they're fed by the government. But then you end up losing the dogs on the street. So these things are all established thanks to the power of being in power for too long. Erdogan has been there for 23 years, and he can wait. He can wait for the public to grow uninterested in a particular subject. For example, the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, they detain him, they put him into prison. It's a whole scandal, a big shock, a very big injustice. Then for 2 weeks, people are enraged. Everyone is on the streets, but the government doesn't mind. They can wait for another few weeks. And, people have to go to work. They have other stuff to do. And the next election is in 2028, another 3 years. If the government has the luxury to wait for Kevin Spacey-like politicians, that's a great advantage. And when you have all the control over the courts, when you don't have any pushback from the courts, unlike Donald Trump, you have much more leeway. You can do more things your way and at your pace. So these are all the advantages of Erdogan. But there's also the problem that this mindset, which is very cynical and very, very scheming and all that, I think it creates kind of anger in people who want to believe in ideals, who are even romantics like me. We want to live in an ethical society. You just want to get rid of all types of cynicism in your life. You want to kind of cleanse cynicism from your life. And that applies not just to the governing party, but all its extensions. So I think that's growing in Turkey, this growing anger toward cynicism, because that is a very big disease. It destroys you if you just internalize the values of this government. If you become cynical about everything, I can play with Russia and Ukraine, and I can sell this to that and that to that. It's all about profit. It's all about survival. It really starts to eat you from inside. I think this is why people turn to books, to reading. The book publishing industry in Turkey is in a very good place. People are reading classics. People are really moving away from social media and so going to books.
How wonderful. That really is wonderful. That's not something you hear a lot from anywhere.
Yes, and people read Judith Butler, Engels, Marx, Zizek. I think there's a big understanding that this is something bigger than Turkey, the kind of normative regime that the government is trying to impose on us. This is happening everywhere, it's happening with the anti-trans laws in the US, and this is happening in Viktor Orban's Hungary. All these anti-woke campaigns take their, I think, influence from each other. And so I think we cannot solve this by reading opposition columnists in Turkey or just news in Turkey. We have to look at the theory behind that. We have to do what Steve Bannon has been doing. And I keep bringing him up, but I think we have to study this on an international scale because there are so many similarities, and we can get some similarities in resistance as well, because people find very interesting ways to resist this cloud of oppression. And so I think Turkish people are looking elsewhere to books, European books, books produced by the global South, or classics to find ways of resistance.
Two more questions for you. One is, so the former Istanbul mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, he's still in jail right now, correct? And I mean, what do you see in his future? Because he is detained because he presented a kind of a credible opposition, as I understand it, to Erdoğan. If I can ask you to look in your crystal ball, how do you see this playing out?
Yes, he's a very good orator, very similar to Erdoğan. He's very well versed in Islam and also progressive politics. He can go to a mosque and recite the Quran, reading from his iPhone, but he's also very good with building bridges between different sectors of society. So very real siyasetçi, he knows how to ride the horse. And that's what made him dangerous, because he's very young and in good health. And he has this image of a competent Turkish politician. And that turned him into a big threat for Erdoğan's reign, because now the system in Turkey is a one-man regime. And if there's another man who can replace the one man at the moment, that's a big problem, because the kind of charisma that Erdoğan has comes from him being in power. It feeds itself. The power feeds itself. But this mayor comes from a small part of Istanbul, and he has this kind of self-confidence in him that made him a very good speaker, but also a threat to the governing regime. I think the issue is Turkey wants to present itself as a maker of drones, a very important player in the military industries. But the Istanbul's mayor, who's been in prison for 2 months, he's coming from a social democratic tradition. And he said, I'm going to allocate the money to giving free milk to people. And I'm going to allocate the money to giving $2 lunches to people. And he had all these kind of Nordic programs. Like I was saying, we were living like Nordic countries for a few years, all these social services and all these free stuff that we are not used to. But the government built this neoliberal system where it's all about self-sufficiency and survival of the fittest. So I think the system will not allow him to go out. I think it's not just Erdoğan, it's the system itself, the military-industrial complex. They see this whole social democratic opposition as a big threat to its own designs. Turkey very patiently built its military industries, and they want to make money out of it. They don't want Turkey to be a social democratic country where the main issue the government is tackling is inequality and hunger. They just want to leave it to Islamic lodges. Islamic lodges can feed people, and you become a follower of some sheikh or something, and then they can feed you. And then the government can produce more drones or whatever. So I think they see this real danger of a social democratic president. That would be the end of the new Turkey project. That would be the beginning of something new, and that's what they fear.
Okay, my last question for you. Is there anything the United States can learn from Turkey as we face growing authoritarianism?
Yes, I think the US is very self-obsessed, and I mean, it's in the American mind. You just live your own fantasy. You're particular, you are in this high school, you are just one Jeremy, experiencing these problems, and it's particular to you. It's that kind of idea that you are one and you're isolated from others and you have to pave your own way. I think this has to go away. The individualistic mindset needs to be replaced by something more, I think, socialist. I grew up as a kind of critic of socialism because we thought Turkey was a socialist country as well. Before Erdoğan came, lots of bureaucracy and centralized bureaucracy and ideology and all that. That I still don't like, of course, but I think the ability to organize and to talk and to form these connections, it's very important. Socialism in that sense, the kind of the belief in masses and educating the masses, all these seemingly romantic gestures, Americans just should give up cynicism. Then they should be more kind of romantic in that sense and believe in transforming themselves and forming bridges with other countries and learning where other countries are on the map, basically. Just studying more geography. I think lots of American writers have done a great job. For example, Susie Hansen, my old neighbor in Istanbul, he wrote a book about the American imperialism in countries like Turkey and its effects there. It's a kind of reckoning with post-American world. And I think the America that Trump wants is an America that's mighty and muscular, and the kind of the imperial America And I think young people especially have to learn what that America was and how it impacted countries in the Middle East, in Europe, and similar outcome can come with Trump's own muscular America. And some people should get ready for that and just study it. Geography, history, those are good things.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kaya. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn, together with Maria Repnikova. The show is edited by Cadra Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the Guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymno Pedi No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review. And if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com. Thank you so much, Kaya.
Thank you, Jeremy.